Now you and your friends can relive the epic duels of Battle City with Yugi's Magnet Warriors and Kaiba's XYZ machines. Plus new monsters you've never seen before. Structure Deck Yugi and Structure Deck Kaiba. 45 cards per deck, each deck sold separately.
I've always found structure decks to be one of the most intriguing products in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game. Starter decks are basically meant to just be an introductory product. They're designed to familiarize newcomers with the basic rules and mechanics of the game. But structure decks are a little different. They're crafted to showcase and support specific strategies and themes. Each structure deck provides a cohesive deck list that's centered around a particular archetype or play style, so it allows players to dive straight into the engaging gameplay right out of the box, and they offer a solid foundation for further customization and deck development. As it happens, we've actually played with nearly every single Yu-Gi-Oh! Structure deck in a video at some point on this channel, so something I thought would be fun is to go through the 10 original structure decks that Konami released from 2005 to 2007, and we'll take a look at what each one brought to the table and then rank them on factors like power level, theming, and overall playability. From Dragon's Roar and Zombie Madness in early 2005 all the way to Machine Revolt in 2007. And maybe we can learn you a bit of Yu-Gi-Oh! History along the way. Alright, let's run it. Our story begins with structure decks Dragon's Roar and Zombie Madness, both released on January 1st, 2005. Up to this point, Yu-Gi-Oh! Only had character-based starter decks, Yugi and Kaiba at first, Joey and Pegasus later, and eventually Yugi and Kaiba Evolution. These decks were cool for what they were, since you got an ace card from the anime and kids would easily recognize them on a store shelf, but at the end of the day, these were still starter decks with little to no strategy or cohesion beyond just showing you Yu-Gi-Oh!'s basic rules. So, for the game's first several runs of structure decks, Konami made two key decisions. First and most importantly, structure decks focused on specific monster types or attributes. These decks also, to some degree, defined the general gameplay styles that would go along to be associated with them, like fire being associated with burn damage and other stuff like that. The second key decision was that these decks were released in pairs. This made them great for introducing people, especially kids, to the game because you and a friend could each get one of the two decks and then play them against each other. Typically, there was a vague theme between the two, like Earth versus Wind, for example. Unfortunately, Konami no longer does the double structure deck strategy for releasing them anymore today, which I think is a bit of a shame. For all the structure decks that were released in pairs, I'll be talking about some of their aspects as a duo, but still ranking them separately because, trust me, they're not all made equal. Oh, yeah, and unlike starter decks at the time that had 50 cards, structure decks had 40 cards, which right off the bat was likely meant to convey the importance of having a smaller and more consistent deck size for competitive play. Let's start with Dragon's Roar. The whole idea here is to run, well, dragons. You get a few different takes on the strategy inside, from Red Eyes to Armed Dragons, and the cover card is Red Eyes Darkness Dragon, used by Atticus Rhodes in the Yu-Gi-Oh! GX anime. It's a sort of upgraded form of Red Eyes that gains 300 attack for each dragon in your grave, so the idea is to drop it as a sort of late game finisher with somewhere in the 3000s or even 4000s attack range. You special summon it by tributing a Red Eyes Black Dragon on your field. This specific strategy is a bit of a tough one to pull off though. Getting out Red Eyes Black Dragon takes 2 tributes, which is asking for a lot when it only got 2400 attack points, something that was already outclassed in early Yu-Gi-Oh! By cards like Summon Skull. There's even a better single tribute monster that's actually in this deck that we're going to get to in a moment, and until you manage to get a Red Eyes Black Dragon on the field, Darkness Dragon is completely unusable in your hand. It has to be summoned with its specific method, and you can't even dump it to the graveyard and revive it with the premature burial in this deck. Now, this is all slightly helped by the fact that the deck includes a copy of Red Eyes Black Chick, which can tribute itself, summon a Red Eyes Black Dragon from your hand, effectively lessening the tribute cost and speeding up the game plan a little bit in general, but there's still one other big issue here. The deck only contains one copy of each of these 3 cards. And no, this isn't because these structures are limited to single copies of cards, because we'll see shortly that there are multiples of things. No, this was just an intentional decision and one that makes the entire Red Eyes package extremely unreliable. But that's only one side of the deck. You also get 2 copies each of Armed Dragons level 3 and 5. Armed Dragon level 3 is not very strong, but if it can survive for a turn, then you can send it away to summon out Armed Dragon level 5 straight from the deck, which is a pretty big deal at the time. Level 5 has 2400 attack and a useful destruction effect, plus it could even be tribute summoned normally if you need to, so it's not a complete brick in the hand. I think this part of the deck works reasonably well, though the deck doesn't really give you any defensive traps to protect an Armed Dragon level 3 in battle outside of maybe Curse of Anubis, so you're mostly out of luck in this department too. Now, this deck also includes a single copy of the Graveyard in the 4th Dimension, which shuffles back any 2 level monsters from your grave back into the deck, like the LV monsters. To be frank though, it's pretty awful. The idea was, I guess, that like in a late game scenario you could reset this engine, but in practicality this is just another brick, especially if you open with it. Rounding out the monsters, we get a few nice additions. Luster Dragon is a reliable 1900 vanilla beat stick, and you get 2 copies of it. Pretty cool. One-headed Behemoth can actually come back after it's destroyed, which helps to mitigate the hefty tribute summons of Red Eyes or Armed Dragon level 5. Element Dragon just kind of exists. And finally, there's 3 copies of Masked Dragon to kind of bring everything together. It reliably protects you in battle and would safely tutor out an Armed Dragon level 3 or Red Eyes Black Chick from your deck. As for the spells and trap cards, you get a couple of dragon-specific ones. Stamping Destruction is a pretty solid back row removal card with a handy little burn effect on top, and it only requires you to control a dragon, which is an easy enough requirement. The 2 continuous traps, Dragon's Bead and Dragon's Rage, aren't too impressive, but they do provide a bit of loose protection and give you a way to deal a little extra battle damage to your opponent. I'm a bit surprised this deck didn't include either Dragon's Gunfire or a Wingbeat of Giant Dragon, 2 solid dragon support cards that were already released at the time. They both have their drawbacks, but I think they could have added a little bit of extra flavor here. We'll talk about the rest of the staple spell and traps in a bit, since this deck and Zombie Madness mostly share the same ones. Okay, moving over to the Zombie Madness deck. I'll just say it right off the bat, this is the better of the 2 decks. Even in this early stage of Yu-Gi-Oh!, zombies were simply a better type than dragons, with better cards on average and a slightly more refined playstyle. The centerpiece here is Vampire Genesis. Similar to Red Eye's Darkness Dragon, you can only summon it by banishing a Vampire Lord from your field. So that means getting Vampire Lord itself to the field. However, there are some huge differences working in Zombie's favor here. Vampire Lord is a level 5 single tribute monster compared to Red Eye's Black Dragon's double tribute summon requirement. But even more than that, you can summon Vampire Lord straight from the deck using Pyramid Turtle, which cuts out a lot of the confusion. It doesn't hurt that Vampire Lord actually has an effect. Granted, it's nothing amazing, but it's at least usable compared to vanilla Red Eyes. As for Vampire Genesis itself, it's got a really respectable 3000 attack right out of the gate. And even though Darkness Dragon can potentially get stronger than that, we all know Yu-Gi-Oh! Values consistent strength over variability. And much like with Vampire Lord, Genesis also has an effect. You can discard a zombie from your hand to summon a lower level one from your graveyard, which is actually huge for building up board presence and outgrinding the opponent. Outside of that, the deck still just has a solid array of standalone monsters. Spirit Reaper was already a competitive staple, being battle prone and letting you sneak a card out of your opponent's hand anytime they're open to a direct attack. You get 2 reliable single tribute monsters in Ryukoki and the very destructive Dark Dust Spirit. There's also a secondary pair of monsters in Despair from the Dark and Double Costin, basically meant to act as an easy double tribute for a beefy 2800 attack monster. Even the latent vampire strategy of Soul Absorbing Bone Tower, Vampire Lord, and Vampire Lady can gradually drain your opponent of cards. Even if this isn't a reliable win condition or anything, at least the cards are doing something compared to their mostly sterile dragon counterparts. But the real glue that holds this entire thing together is Pyramid Turtle. Compared to the average battle tutor monster like Masked Dragon, Pyramid Turtle offers a very generous range in what you can summon from the deck. Grabbing Spirit Reaper effectively lets you halt your opponent's battle phase. You can get the previously mentioned Vampire Lord if you need to summon out Genesis. You can even summon a free 2400 attack Ryukoki. Just like that. It's actually insane just how much utility this card provides for the deck, and you get 3 copies, so it'll be showing up a lot too. Oh yeah, and the spell and trap cards in this deck don't disappoint either. Call of the Mummy acts as a reliable starter card that lets you just get your deck moving faster, summoning any zombie monster from your hand, even letting you skip tribute summoning for Ryukoki or Despair from the Dark, which is like kind of crazy. It's actually wild how proactive this card is, and you get 3 copies of it. Plus there's 2 copies of Book of Life, which effectively functions as a Monster Reborn. This pairs even better when you consider the deck comes with the absolutely ridiculous Card of Safe Return. Yes, anytime you summon a zombie from the grave, whether that's your Book of Life or with Vampire Genesis, you're getting a free draw on top of it. Both decks share most of the same spell and trap card staples. Pot of Greed for a free dig into more cards, Nobleman of Crossout to snipe a set Masked Dragon or a Pyramid Turtle, Heavy Storm for dealing with back row, and a Snatch Steal for turning the tables. It's actually wild to see just how many of these power spells Konami was including in structure decks back then. Some of them weren't even high rarity cards at the time, but it's still cool just to see so many included in one $10 box. Even here though, I have to say the Dragon deck just gets the short end of the stick. Zombies get deadly traps like Torrential Tribute and Compulsory Evacuation Device, while the Dragons are kind of just stuck with more awkward ones like Curse of Anubis, Ceasefire, and Interdimensional Matter Transporter. Still, Dragons do get Premature Burial and Call the Haunted, which are technically easier to use than Zombies Book of Life, but it's hard to compare to the better synergy that Zombies are getting in general in return. All in all, both of these decks are at least solid and a decent start to our long list of Yu-Gi-Oh! Structure decks. Neither deck had a truly defined focus or strategy, but that's understandable for being the first products of their kind. Now, I'd like to say a duelist couldn't go wrong with either one, but that just wouldn't really be fair at all. The Zombie deck is better in nearly every meaningful metric, and it's not particularly close either. Trust me, we have pitted these two specific decks against each other several times, and I know. So, for the ratings, this isn't going to be a bit unfair, because obviously the products are only going to get better from here, but I'll still try to keep my assessments relative to the time that each product was released. With that said, we're going to put Zombie Madness in the B tier, and unfortunately, Dragon's Roar is going in the D tier. But hey, D for Dragons or something, right? Next up, we move to a new pair of structure decks, Blaze of Destruction and Fury from the Deep. They both released in May 2005, and as you can probably tell from the names and the boxes, these next structure decks went from being type-centric strategies to instead showcasing two opposing attributes. And despite being just a few months after Dragon's Roar and Zombie Madness, they actually show a pretty noticeable increase in card power and synergy. I'd also say from my experience, these two decks stand out as the ones I remember the most amount of people back from my childhood actually playing. I suppose that probably varies from place to place. Anyway, we'll start with Blaze of Destruction. So obviously the draw here is fire monsters. The ace card is Infernal Flame Emperor, and right off the bat, it's something of a side grade over the last pair of aces. You actually can't special summon it, so you've got to do a tribute summon. At 2700 attack, it's far from the best thing you could be sacrificing two monsters for in this deck, but it does let you banish up to 5 fire monsters in your grave and then destroy an equal number of spell and trap cards. I actually kind of like this effect because it feels like something you're meant to use in the middle to late stages of a duel, clearing the way for a big comeback. In practice though, this card isn't actually all that important in the deck. It already includes Heavy Storm, Mystical Space Typhoon, and Dust Tornado for dealing with back row in a more practical manner, and again, while 2700 attack isn't awful, you've got other strong monsters like Thestalos the Firestorm Monarch, which is a single tribute monster for 2400 attack, Raging Flame Sprite that can work its way up to even larger attack values every time it attacks directly with its own effect, and Ultimate Baseball Kid that just powers up when you have other fires in the field. And if push comes to shove, there's even Gaia Soul the Combustible Collective that can full send for up to 4000 attack points. So yeah, this deck isn't exactly lacking in the power department. The other big strategy at play here is the passive burn effects that many of your fire monsters have. Inferno, Ultimate Baseball Kid, Solar Flare Dragon, Thestalos, the spell Meteor of Destruction, Dark Room of Nightmare, and the continuous trap Backfire can all inflict damage to your opponent on the side, which kind of made up Fire's identity as an attribute in early Yu-Gi-Oh! You aren't necessarily going to win the game off these effects alone, but they quickly put pressure on your opponent, especially because things like Flame Sprite and Baseball Kid can both be attacking threats as well, and Solar Flare Dragon can actually create a soft lock where just having 2 copies of it on the field prevents either one from being attacked while they slowly drain your opponent's life points. And of course, this deck gets 3 copies of UFO Turtle, which can tutor out almost all of your key players straight from the deck when it's destroyed in battle. Spell and trap wise, you're getting another solid lineup here. I already talked about the spell and trap removal, but you also get highlights like Snatch Steal, Premature Burial, Pot of Greed, and Tribute to the Doomed. Another new addition for this and the water deck is that both included 2 copies of a corresponding field spell. Here we get Molten Destruction, which beefs up your fire monsters by 500 points. I actually think this deck in particular gets a lot of mileage with this buff, because monsters like Flame Sprite and Baseball Kid become much scarier with that boost, much faster, and they turn your UFO Turtle into a floating 2000 attack beater. Or you can set up a pair of unattackable 2000 attack point Solar Flare Dragons that are also burning your opponent every turn. One last card I want to point out here is Level Limit Area B. It forces all level 4 and higher monsters to defense position. This once again synergizes pretty well with the deck because there are cards like Solar Flare Dragon where they just get to be a passive threat even when they're in defense mode, and Baseball Kid and Flame Sprite get to sneak right under this effect and attack your opponent anyway. All in all, this deck is probably the first structure that can feel truly oppressive in practice. It's far from broken, but the amount of ways you can both wall your opponent out while simultaneously ramping up your threat level, really pretty nasty work. And the icing on top is that the deck is really easy to just pick up and play. Almost any combination of cards in it will work reasonably well. So we're putting Blaze of Destruction into the A tier. Moving on, let's talk Fury from the Deep. It's the water counterpart to Blaze of Destruction, and right off the bat, we get one of our most iconic structure deck bosses in Ocean Dragon Lord Neo Daedalus. Unlike the fire structure deck, this boss monster channels more of that Red Eyes Darkness Dragon, Vampire Lord type beat, where you have to summon a regular monster first and then tribute it for your boss monster. In this case, being Levia Dragon Daedalus. So both monsters are pretty similar. They can send an Umi from your field to the graveyard and clear everything else on the board. Levia Dragon just sends everything on the field, but Neo Daedalus even wipes both players' hands, setting you up for a big direct and, ideally, game-winning attack. Fun fact, actually, this card used to be seen as the poor man's Chaos Emperor Dragon since it had a similar effect, but was a lot easier to get your hands on. Speaking of Yui, several of the cards in this deck revolve around it being on the field. Amphibious Bugroth can attack directly, Mermaid Knight can attack twice, and the continuous trap card Tornado Wall nullifies battle damage while it's in the field. Compared to Molten Destruction, Yumi does leave you a bit wanting. It only gives your water monsters a 200 attack boost, which is pretty tame compared to the 500 one that fire gets. However, it does get the additional passive effect of reducing your monster's levels by 1 in the field and in the hand. Which means you can actually tribute summon Levia Dragon with only 1 tribute instead of 2, which is pretty nice. But a slightly more niche application is that it lets your low-level water monsters sneak under the effects of Gravity Bind and Level Limit Area B and attack anyway, which could come in handy especially if you're facing the fire structure deck. You get a few other cool monsters here too. Tribe Infecting Virus is an infamous card that lets you discard a card, call a monster type, and destroy all of them on the field. It's a hard deck check to mono-type decks, and if you happen to be facing the fire structure, it makes a really great way to out those soft locks like Solar Flare Dragon. Oh yeah, and it can do this multiple times per turn too. Yeah, Tribe Infecting Virus is wild, and it got banned for years for good reason. Fenrir is a bit of a tougher one to summon because you have to banish 2 water monsters from your grave, and it only has 1400 attack, but its effect makes your opponent skip their next draw phase if it can destroy a monster in battle. Pull this off at the right time, and it can quite easily just halt your opponent's momentum entirely. Still got a couple more standout monsters to go. Like the last few structure decks, this deck does give you a generic water tutor in the form of Mother Grizzly. Unfortunately though, it can't summon out Tribe Infecting Virus or Fenrir, so I find its uses are a little bit underwhelming here. Your best bet is honestly just summoning out an Unshaven Angler for an easy double tribute summon on your next turn. And the last standout monster is Mobius the Frost Monarch. Like the Stalas, this guy is a 2400 attack beater with a really strong on-summon effect to just clear 2 spells and traps. Like its counterpart, you get strong staples like Pot of Greed, Snatch Steal, and Premature Burial, and Heavy Storm in here. 2 exclusive standouts though are Hammer Shot, which is a pretty powerful spot removal that's generally just better than the Fire deck's Tribute to the Doomed, and Torrential Tribute, which is a devastating trap that can completely turn the tables on your opponent if they overextend. You also get Creature Swap, which makes for a pretty scary combo with Mother Grizzly. You can snatch an opponent's monster, give them your Grizzly, attack over it, and then you get to summon another free monster from your deck. Real table turner if you find the right opportunity for it. The deck also gets Big Wave, Small Wave, which is basically just a slightly easier way of bringing out your Levia Dragon from the hand. Salvage is actually a really nice recovery card that gets 2 waters for under 1500 attack back from the grave, and while most of these monsters alone aren't amazing, you can never complain about recovering resources, especially in old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Oh yeah, and there's also Gravity Bind, which is a similar stall card to Level Limit that your smaller monsters can conveniently get around. A couple of quirky cards here too. Spell Shield Type 8 can stop any spell that targets one of your monsters for free. Or if you want, you can just negate any spell card period, but you'll have to discard your own first. This flexibility combined with being a counter trap, so spell speed 3, make it surprisingly useful. Then there's Zing Zen Hu, which locks down 2 of your opponent's set spell or traps as long as it's in the field. Not incredible in a vacuum, but it can help to keep your field under control. Overall, I'd say the Fury from the Deep structure deck is a bit more technical to play than Blaze of Destruction. It's got a solid strategy that can actually devastate the opponent when it works, but relying so heavily on Yumi me can be a bit inconsistent, and Mother Grizzly doesn't have particularly good targets like UFO Turtle, and also a lot of the cards just require a tad bit more finesse to use than Blaze of Destruction's consistently lower risk, high value plays. When it works and it's pretty good, but when it doesn't, the deck kind of flounders, so I'm sticking this one in the C tier. Next structure deck is Warrior's Triumph. So this one's a bit interesting because it actually released late in 2005, but a couple months before its companion deck, Spellcaster's Judgment. Anyway, in case the title wasn't obvious, this deck is all about warriors. And right off the bat, I can say it's a good one. Warriors in general were always some of the best monsters in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh! So let's get straight to why. The cover card is Guilford the Legend, not to be confused with Joey's more iconic Guilford the Lightning from the anime. Anyway, this one's a bit of a mix on the ace card formula that we're used to because it actually can't be special summoned at all. You just have to tribute summon it. Not great, but its actual effect is pretty cool. You get to take equip spells from your grave and equip them to any warriors you control. Pretty much gonna just probably be him, but it could actually be any combination of monsters that you want. 2600 attack isn't amazing for a 2 tribute monster, but presumably equip spells are kind of meant to make up for that anyway. That's a great segue into this deck's primary strategy, equip spells. You're getting a whole load of them here. Lightning Blade, Fusion Sword Murasame, Flamberg Bow, and the infamous Divine Sword Phoenix Blade that can recycle itself. There's even technically the trap card Blast with Chain too. And Fairy of the Spring for recovering your equips from the grave. All these cards basically power up your monsters, but some give additional effects too. Equips aren't generally seen as amazing in Yu-Gi-Oh! Because they're kind of useless on their own, but I think this deck makes it work because while some of your monsters' effects make use of them, they're also just pretty reliable monsters in their own right. So let's meet our all-star cast, shall we? Goblin Attack Force is absolutely huge for a level 4 monster. Its 2300 attack can hang with most single tribute monsters at the time, and even if it had a big drawback, I still think it's good. Double copies of Marauding Captain meant you could get cards in the field faster than most other decks, and having 2 of them actually force your opponent into an attack lock. You add in Command Knight, buffing up your monsters and dodging attacks itself, and suddenly things get a lot more annoying for your opponent. Exiled Force was still an innovative card at the time, offering immediate spot removal. DD Warrior Lady could effectively banish any other monster in a battle, and Ninja Grandmaster Sasuke could instantly clear face-up defense position monsters. Oh yeah, and Armed Samurai Benkei gets extra attacks for every equip card that it's got. This card alone was actually the centerpiece of a lot of decks back in the day. The deck does have a few weaker links though. Gearfried the Iron Knight is a bit of an oddball card since it destroys your own equip spells, but it's meant to be used with Release Restraint to summon its more powerful Gearfried the Swordmaster form. This way, equipping cards to it actually starts letting you pop opposing monsters, which is really scary if it works, but it does make for a couple of really rough bricks if it doesn't. The Mystic Swordsman in level 2 and level 4 are also an awkward gimmick combination. Level 2 can use its effect to destroy face down monsters if it battles, which is nice, but it actually has an effect where if it destroys a monster in a regular battle, that's how it levels up, so it's kind of contradictory. As for the spells and traps, this is actually where we see a bit of deviation from what we're used to. Because cards like Pot of Greed were getting banned around this time, they stopped including it in structure decks. Still, you're getting Snatch Steal, Heavy Storm, Giant Trunade, which is new, and the powerful new Lightning Vortex. But the one absolutely huge inclusion here is 2 copies of Reinforcement of the Army. This spell lets you basically search your deck for any useful level 4 warrior that you want for free, and that offers a level of consistency that was never before seen in a structure deck up to now, and one that would still never really be replicated for a long time at least. Traps are pretty standard fare, but I do want to call attention to Royal Decree. This was a really powerful floodgate at the time when traps were far more prevalent in Yu-Gi-Oh! No more Mirror Force, no more Torrential Tribute, Sakuretsu Armor, anything like that. Flipping this thing up and then just going to town with warriors and equips could actually be really oppressive. All in all, this Warrior Strike deck was probably the best structure deck they'd released up to this point. Like Blaze of Destruction, I think its biggest strength is just how straightforward and effective it is. It's strong, simple cards with pretty good individual value and even better in combination. Structure decks are really coming into their own here. We're throwing this one even higher up in the A tier. Okay, Spellcaster's Judgment. It dropped in January 2006, just a couple short months after Warrior's Triumph. Not sure why the slight delay, but whatever. If you couldn't guess, this one's all about Spellcasters. And where the Warrior deck focused on equip spells as its strategy, this deck utilizes its own unique gimmick in spell counters. So let's see what's going on here. Ace monster is Dark Eradicator Warlock. He's channeling that Red Eyes Darkness Dragon energy again by only being summonable through tributing a Dark Magician on your field. Right off the bat, that's kind of a mark against it. You all know the song and dance to this point. Red Eyes and Dark Magician are cool cards, but they suck to summon, and it's even more to ask you to tribute them off again after that for something in your hand. Still, this guy's effect isn't bad. You deal 1,000 damage anytime a normal spell gets activated, and that's from you or your opponent. So as bosses go, this is a pretty scary one to drop in the late stages of a duel. Now, as for the other monsters, that's where this deck gets pretty hot and cold. We get some obvious standouts like Breaker the Magical Warrior being a 1900 beater that also packs back row removal, Tsukiyomi being a recurring answer to most problem cards, and the very deadly Chaos Sorcerer, who I'd honestly call this deck's real boss monster. In fact, speaking of 1900 attackers, this deck is pretty distinct for having quite a few of them. Outside of Breaker, there's also Gemini Elf and Skilled Dark Magician. This alone makes this deck surprisingly strong in the normal summon beatstick department, plus Skilled Dark can lead you to summoning Dark Magician from the deck, so it makes that Eradicator Warlock play a little bit more feasible too. Another standout card is Apprentice Magician. This deck is the first structure to lack a regular battle tutor like Pyramid Turtle or Mother Grizzly, so this is the next best thing. You get a level 2 or lower Spellcaster from your deck face down. Summoning another Apprentice Magician for next turn and flipping it up to place a spell counter isn't awful. Sometimes it just fails to make much of an impact. A more potent target here would probably be Magician of Faith, which gets back any spell from your grave when it's flipped. It's a really powerful effect that eventually got the card banned, but I will stress that its power is contingent on actually having your best spells in the grave already, which isn't always the case. I'm just not in love with these cards, especially when you're already down in the duel. I hate to say it, but the rest of the deck's monsters are kinda just stinkers. White Magician Pikaru and Ebon Magician Kuron just don't really have the stats to survive long enough to use their life point burn and heal effects in the standby phase. Blast Magician and Mythical Beast Cerberus are kinda just diet Breaker the Magical Warriors. Rapid Fire Magician could theoretically be the burn card that you need in a pinch, but there's almost always something else you'd rather summon. And even the infamous Royal Magical Library, which should theoretically net you a couple free draws, just lacks some reliable way to actually get and safely stay on the field. The Spell and Trap lineup has the usual staple card suspects. Premature Burial makes a return after a suspicious absence from the Warrior structure deck. Heavy Storm and Lightning Vortex are here to clear boards, and Mage Power actually makes for a really scary attack buff on a single monster. We also get Nobleman of Crossout, which is really handy for sniping set monsters, but I find the actual Spellcaster themed cards to be pretty lacking here. Magical Blast is supposed to be a burn card that can sort of recycle itself, but it's just not worth it unless it's like the very end of the duel. Fusion Wave Motion can also make for a really flashy finish, but it's useless if you don't actually have a high level Spellcaster to use it on. Magical Dimension is actually a pretty cool mix of removal and summoning a monster from your hand, and it being a quick play spell really helps, so you can potentially even skip a tribute summon. But it's still a neg 1 in card economy, and weirdly, a couple of the spellcasters in this deck, namely Eradicator Warlock and Rapid Fire Magician, only want you to use normal spells for their effects. Pitch Black Power Stone is supposed to sort of be like a mana source for your spell counter monsters, and it can be kind of neat with Breaker the Magical Warrior or maybe even Skilled Dark Magician, but a lot of times I just find it to be a dead card since it has no real purpose on its own. I did notice this deck includes both Swords of Revealing Light and Nightmare Steel Cage, so I guess they knew that your weaker monsters kind of need the protection. Two pretty fun traps here are Magic Cylinder, which combined with the handful of other burn effects in this deck can actually steal you a win out of nowhere, and I really like Divine Wrath as well. I'm always a fan of potential counter traps that can sort of reward a player for correctly assessing threats. Oh yeah, and Spell Shield Type 8 makes a return here too, so even more points in that department. Overall, I find the Spellcaster's Judgment deck feels a bit like Fury from the Deep. It can either work pretty well or kind of just fail to launch. Obviously, this product benefits from being a bit newer, so you still get slightly stronger lineups of cards in general, and we can't discount the pretty high highs of like Breaker and Chaos Sorcerer. I think this is another case of rewarding players for careful decision making compared to its companion deck, Warrior's Triumph, which is more linear and easy to play, but with a slightly lower skill ceiling, so I'm gonna stick this one at the top of B tier. Next structure deck on our list is Invincible Fortress. This one dropped in May 2006, just a couple months before its opposing deck, Lord of the Storm. So you might have noticed a pattern here. First pair of structures was 2 types, the second pair was 2 attributes, the third pair was 2 types again, and now we're back to 2 opposing attributes. Invincible Fortress is all about earth monsters and more specifically the flip summoning mechanic. Your cover card is Exod, Master of the Guard. It's pretty cool how this is sort of like an actual monster form of Exodia. Can't be normal summon, surprise surprise, but you can only bring him out by tributing a Sphinx monster. I actually really like this change though, because even though it's a bit awkward to summon, deck actually has 3 different Sphinx monsters you could use for it, and they're all just single tribute cards, unlike Dark Magician or Red Eyes. But the likelihood of actually summoning Exod is reasonably high. Like Eradicator Warlock, his effect burns your opponent for 1000 damage each time an earth monster gets flip summoned. It's a tad bit harder to pull off than just activating a normal spell, but the same general principle applies. Drop this guy late in the game and it's probably lights out. Oh, and I should probably mention he's got 0 attack, but a whopping 4000 defense, so it's nearly impossible to actually swing over in battle. So in order to talk about this deck, we have to briefly discuss the flip mechanic. The majority of monsters here want to be flip summoned, usually get a powerful effect, and then in some cases they can flip themselves back down to use it again the next turn. Also worth noting is that some monsters have flip effects where those activate whenever they get flipped face up, whether that's by battle or a card effect or a flip summon. Other cards only get these effects when you flip summon them, and those are typically the better ones. The obvious downside here is that setting a monster and waiting to flip it up is pretty slow and costs you a lot of tempo in a duel. However, the deck does offer a couple ways to mitigate that. So let's go over some standout monsters. Golem Sentry has a solid 1800 defense and it can bounce an opponent's monster back to their hand. This is deceptively good removal since it puts your opponent a turn back and is extra devastating if you manage to hit something that they had a tribute summon for. After that, you can get in a quick attack with it before you use its effect to flip itself back down for the next turn. Guardian Statue is basically the same thing, but with a little less defense. And Medusa Worm is similar, but it actually destroys monsters instead of just returning them to the hand, though at the cost of much smaller stats. Your 2 copies of Maui Interceptor cannons can flip themselves down, but they don't really have any other effect, so it's mostly just for hit and runs. 2000 defense is nice though. Next we gotta talk about the 3 Sphinx monsters. Like we said before, you can tribute any of them to summon Exod, but they're all pretty solid in their own right for the cost of a tribute summon. Hiriko Sphinx is the sole offensive one. It's got a 2400 attack point, respectable amount, and prevents your opponent from attacking face down defense position monsters. So this gets around the weakness of cards like Medusa Worm by ensuring they'll get to be flip summoned on your next turn. Cryo Sphinx on the other hand adds a stipulation that whenever a monster returns from the field to the hand, that player has to discard a random card. This pairs well with Golem Sentry and Guardian Statue, plus the deck's 2 copies of Compulsory Evacuation Device. It basically makes those effects a lot more lethal. The issue with Cryo Sphinx though is that its low attack and high defense means you'd probably want to tribute Set it first, and that's kind of a wasted turn, especially compared to Guardian Sphinx. It's got 2400 defense as well, but when you flip summon it, you get to bounce all your opponent's monsters back to the hand, and then it can flip itself back face down to potentially do it all again next turn. All 3 of these monsters are on the slower side, but they all support the deck in different ways. That said, it's a bit of a shame that the deck didn't include Grandmarg the Rock Monarch, since it fits thematically and it offers a pretty solid value the moment it hits the field, unlike the Sphinxes. Some other quick notables. Gigantes summons itself by banishing an earth monster from your grave, which is a surprisingly easy cost to fill, and it's a solid 1900 attack beater. If it dies in battle, it wipes all the spell and trap cards on the field. You get 2 copies too, so it's pretty reliable. Mega Rock Dragon also acts as a sort of second boss monster that's capable of getting to pretty scary high stats if it drops late enough in the game, though it could conflict with Gigantes sometimes since they technically are sharing the same resource pool. And finally, Giant Rat brings up the rear with a reliable battle tutor effect, especially handy for getting out cards like Golem Sentry, then using those effects to flip themselves down on your next turn, flip summoning them again, bouncing a monster, and then going right back face down again. Rat also conveniently has the highest defense of all the attribute-based battle floaters for whatever reason, so it's another point in its favor. Spells and traps are solid here. I'll put the usual staples here on screen with a special shout out to including freaking brain control in this deck. And now we can just go over this deck specific stuff. You actually get 2 copies of Shield and Sword. It's surprisingly strong in a deck like this where your monsters mostly have higher defense points, and it's a pretty nasty surprise if you can actually use it on your Exod because it'll have 4000 attack. Ectoplasma is a neat one. At the end of each player's turn, they have to tribute a face-up monster in exchange for some burn damage on their opponent. For this structure deck, the idea is that your monsters won't ever be face-up at the end of your turn, so you can get around this effect while your opponent loses theirs. It's pretty fun when it works. Shifting Shadows, on the other hand, just lets you rearrange your set monsters. Not amazing, but in a slower-paced game, it could maybe throw your opponent off. Ordeal of a Traveler can actually be really annoying, though, for your opponent, because when you combine it with a Compulsory Evacuation Device and the rest of your monsters bounce effects, it basically means this entire deck can just make it really hard for your opponent to ever actually keep any monsters in the field at all. But the real MVP card here is Ultimate Offering. At the cost of 500 life points, you get to do a free normal summon, or in the case of this deck, a set. This drastically speeds up the deck's inherently slow setup problem, and it can literally prepare an entire board of monsters for you to flip up on a following turn. Oh, and no hard ones per turn limit here either. Yeah, there's a reason Ultimate Offering eventually got banned. Oh, an honorable mention to Wabaku and Sword of Revealing Light for helping keep your monsters around long enough to flip back up. So overall, I think this deck surprised me a bit. It's got an uphill climb, having to take a bit more time for your strategy to get rolling, and that also means this deck has next to no way to regain field tempo once it loses it. That said, it's surprisingly annoying when it works. Some duels, your opponent will just never get to keep a monster on the board, and its walling capabilities can make it feel similar to Blaze of Destruction, even if it's not quite as straightforward. Still, I really love the unique flavor this deck provides by leaning in hard to the flip mechanic and just keeping things mono-type and mono-attribute, and so Invincible Fortress breaks its way into the top of C tier. Alright, let's move on to Lord of the Storm, the Wind structure deck from July 2006. The name of the game here this time is Spell and Trap Removal, which kind of defined this attribute in general at the time. So let's talk about it. Boss monster is some more Bird of Divinity. It can't be special summoned, and if you tribute summon it, everything's gotta be wind. Not a problem for this deck, of course. Konami seemed to have a thing for these sort of burn effects on structure deck boss monsters because once again, this monster deals a straight 1000 damage to each player during their respective end phases. The catch though is that this gets reduced by 500 points for each spell or trap that opponent controls. So you can see the idea here. You're constantly depriving your opponent of their spell and traps with your effects, ensuring that they'll always take the full damage while you're safe from harm. Decent boss monster. As for the entourage, it's a bit of a mixed bag. I've been mostly omitting talking about the vanilla monsters in each of these structure decks so far because they tend to just be beat sticks with decent stats, but I have to point out that this deck's two monsters, Sonic Duck and Harpy Girl, are just strangely weaker than the rest. Maybe there weren't any other viable wind options at the time, I'm not actually sure. Anywho, this deck functions around the Harpy Lady cards, which was pretty cool to see at the time. Any one Harpy Lady being on the field opens up your Elegant Egotist, a spell that lets you summon another copy from your deck, or a copy of Harpy Lady's sisters. Harpy Lady 1 is usually your best bet because it just increases attack, but Lady 2 can negate flip effects, which is pretty convenient if the deck happens to be facing off against something like Invincible Fortress. And you also get Harpy's Hunting Ground, a field spell that slightly buffs your wind beasts, but more importantly, mercilessly tears away at your opponent's spell and traps as you summon more Harpies. Be careful though, because if your opponent has nothing to hit, you'll actually have to destroy your own card since it's a mandatory effect. And there's also Bird Face, which is a really specific battle phase tutor that can search for a Harpy Lady. Plus Harpy's pet baby dragon, who gets more effects as you have more Harpies on the field. This little guy can actually be a real menace if it's allowed to be, since it admittedly kind of sucks on its own. And Triangle Ecstasy Smark is an offensive spell that's specifically meant for Harpy Lady's sisters, so it's kind of unreliable. And then Hysteric Party can be a mass monster reborn for your Harpies. In my experience, this entire suite of cards ranges from good, basically Hunting Ground, Egotist, and the late game Party, to clunky, the sisters, Ecstasy Spark, and Baby Dragon. The rest of the highlight monsters are a motley crew. Swift Birdman Joe and Lady Ninja Yay continue the trend of removing spells and traps. Sylpheed is a special summon like Gigantes, and it discards an opponent's card when it falls in battle. Rock from the Valley of Haze is kinda whatever. It's got 2400 attack, decent for a tribute summon monster, but its effect almost never comes up. Blind Kamakiri is your routine attribute battle tutor, bringing out a Harpy Lady to set up an Egotist play, usually being the job. The rest of the highlight monsters are a motley crew. Swift Birdman Joe and Lady Ninja Yay continue the trend of removing spells and traps. Sylpheed is a special summon like Gigantes, and it discards an opponent's card when it falls in battle. Rock from the Valley of Haze is kinda whatever. It's got 2400 attack, decent for a tribute summon monster, but its effect almost never comes up. Blind Kamakiri is your routine attribute battle tutor, and bringing out a Harpy Lady to set up an Egotist play is usually its job. Shout out to the random, but somewhat appreciated Slate Warrior here. At 1900 attack, it's a pretty big threat, and if it does die in battle, it weakens an opponent's monster on the way out. Spell and trap wise, this deck is about the usual fare, though I want to point out a few high points and a couple of lower ones too. Sakuretsu Armor makes its first appearance in a structure deck, and it's quite a welcome one. Since none of these decks have included Mirror Force, for probably pretty good reason, this is the next best thing for stopping attacks. Icarus Attack is also an absolutely brutal removal card that works with your Winged Beast to clear the board. The picks I don't like too much here though are Aqua Chorus, which is meant to work with Harpy Lady but is fairly useless any other time, and then Ninjutsu Art of Transformation, which can summon a Harpy Lady from your deck but literally only works with your one single copy of Lady Ninja Yay. This just can't be relied on at all. I have to say, this deck is not one of my favorites. I don't think it's bad. In fact, like basically every structure so far, it's pretty strong when it works. But the monsters here feel a bit underwhelming when the Harpy strategy isn't working, and we already talked about how even that can be a mixed bag. There's a suspicious lack of decent value tribute summons too. I will admit that I may be underplaying the potency of such persistent spell and trap removal from this deck, but I still think the deck would have a lot of trouble just dealing with actual monsters, which are still the backbone of most Yu-Gi-Oh decks. So unfortunately, I'm putting Lord of the Storm in the C tier. And now we move on to our final pair of structure decks, Dinosaur's Rage and Machine Revolt. These last two decks shake up the formula a bit because they were the first pair of structures that shifted in marketing towards Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, and also had a noticeable focus on type synergy and character inspiration. The power levels here are also a bit higher on average as a result. Dinosaur's Rage came out in October 2006, and it's all about dinosaurs. Shocker. While dinosaurs would later be defined by destruction effects, at this point their whole identity was really just being big beaters with solid battle phase related effects. Our ace card here is Superconductor Tyranno. Unlike the last few structure deck bosses, they finally allow you to normal or special summon this one, so that's a great start. It's also a beefy 3300 attack, which fits with the high attack style of dinos. While you normally have to tribute 2 monsters to summon this guy, the deck does offer a few ways to skirt that. We still get that familiar 1000 damage burn effect though, but this time it's at the cost of tributing a monster, and this card can't attack that same turn. So surprisingly tame effect, and then being once per turn means you can't really abuse it. As for the rest of the monsters, they're kind of just there, and not in a bad way per se, but there's some pretty solid effects here. Hyper Hammerhead can bounce any monster it battles that doesn't get destroyed by that battle back to the hand. It's a pretty nice self-sacrifice if you need to get rid of a troublesome boss monster, and it makes a fairly safe summon in general. Gillosaurus is pretty cool too. It's basically just a free special summon from your hand to set up a tribute, but you'll want to be careful and try to use it before your opponent can benefit from its effect. Another big standout here is Hydrogeddon. When it destroys a monster in battle, you get to summon another copy of itself from your deck. This deck only includes 2 copies, but any player trying to improve it could get a lot of value from just adding a third, since it can string together attacks and build up your field in the process. Another scary pseudo-boss monster is Ultimate Tyranno. At 3000 attack, it's already really big, but can actually attack every single monster your opponent has, so it's a scary board clearing if that just goes unimpeded. For the less impressive monsters, a shout out to Tyranno Infinity. It gets 1000 attack for every banished dinosaur, which can theoretically be huge, but this deck's actually only got 1 card that actually banishes your own dinos. Survival Instinct. So most of the time Infinity's looking more like nothing, or maybe 2000 attack or so if you're lucky. Baby Ceratosaurus is here too, but the deck lacks a way to actually destroy it and trigger its effect outside of some niche things like fossil excavation and volcanic eruption, so you're kind of just hoping your opponent pops it instead. And then Miracle Jurassic Egg is also supposed to be the sort of monster that bides its time in defense mode and eventually lets you get a big dinosaur from your deck, but your opponent's almost always going to just get rid of it first. Spell and trap wise, this and the next structure deck sort of traded out the powerful staple cards from the past structures for more type-based support. You still get Heavy Storm and Lightning Vortex at least, but cards like Riryoku and Mesmeric Control are kind of middling. And Sebek's Blessing is just not it. Malfunction and Goblin Out of the Frying Pan are also kind of clunky counter traps, and Magical Arm Shield would be better off if it was just a copy of Sakuretsu Armor instead. To be fair though, a lot of those broken older spells were banned by this time, so the result here is just a bit of a mixed bag. Anyway, Big Evolution Pill gives you 3 turns of being able to normal summon high-level dinos without tributing. It can be a big help, but the fact that you still have to tribute a dinosaur to activate it, and you'd still need to have high-level monsters to really get use out of it, it's a tough sell. Tail Swipe's pretty cool though. You got a high-level dino in the field, bounce 2 of your opponent's monsters back to the hand. Solid enough. There's the Jurassic World field spell that just gives you a standard 300 attack point buff, but it can pair with Volcanic Eruption to wipe the field, kind of like Neo Daedalus. So that's cool. On the trap side of things, Hunting Instinct is a little bit slow, but it can get out one of your high-level dinos from hand pretty easily. Survival Instinct can set up Tyranno Infinity, but otherwise it's just underwhelming. Seismic Shockwave is sort of random. It's a little situational to use, and it locks up 3 spell and trap zones from your opponent, but you will get a dinosaur back from the grave 3 turns later, so that's something. But the best trap is Fossil Excavation, basically being a Call of the Haunted. Now granted, this takes a discard from your hand, and the monster's effect is negated, so I'm really not sure why they didn't just include Call of the Haunted instead, but whatever, it's on theme I guess. So overall, I guess I'm not too big on the dinosaur deck. There's some decent monsters here, and you can play it as a straightforward beatdown deck. But I think the spell and trap lineup really leaves a lot to be desired in terms of practicality, especially when your themed dino support is kind of just objectively worse than existing staples in the game. Plus, there are still a few largely unrealized strategies here, like Tyranno Infinity, Baby Ceratosaurus, and maybe even like Miracle Jurassic Egg. Unfortunately, I'm tossing Dinosaur's Rage at the bottom of C tier. And that leads us into our last deck of the evening, Machine Revolt from January 2007. A full 2 years after the very first pair of structure decks, let's see what we've got. This deck primarily focuses on Crowler's ancient gear monsters from the GX anime, but it also introduced Yugi's iconic gadgets from the anime for the very first time in the TCG as well. Oh, and there's a little bit of Union stuff in here too. So yeah, let's break all these machines down. Your boss is Ancient Gear Gajiltron Dragon. It's basically an ancient gear monster that was designed to also synergize with the gadgets that you get in the deck. It always gets the signature ancient gear effect of locking your opponent out of spells and traps when it attacks. Alongside that huge 3000 attack stat, this is a pretty scary monster to face on its own merits. But if you tribute summon it using specific gadget monsters, it'll get a couple of other effects like piercing or a small bit of burn damage. Honestly, these are negligible buffs, but they can be pretty neat if you do pull one off. We'll get into the gadgets themselves in a moment, but we should also quickly talk about Gajiltron Chimera. It's a sort of weaker version of Dragon, being a single tribute 2300 attacker with some small buffs if you manage to tribute summon it with a gadget. So with those two out of the way, now we should probably talk about these gadgets. Green, red, and yellow gadget were a unique set of cards at the time. Whenever you summon one, it can search for a specific other one from your deck to the hand. This was basically unprecedented at the time in Yu-Gi-Oh! Monsters that would just immediately net you card advantage on summon and replace themselves. Granted, the gadget's stats weren't very big, but this trio went on to define Yu-Gi-Oh! In a pretty big way for years to come. In the context of this deck though, they're alright. Because you only get one copy of each, you won't be able to go through them over and over during the course of several turns in a duel, but if you do happen to have 2 copies of them in the hand, then the cycle gets broken, so that's the real downside. Still, these monsters make for a pretty safe normal summon, and they ensure that you have something to do on your next turn. The rest of the monsters in this deck are a mixture of existing ancient gears and a few other stray machines. This archetype, unfortunately, struggles a lot. Ancient Gear Beast is a decent single tribute monster since it gets the battle phase spell and trap block, but 2000 attack is still pretty questionable. Golem's a huge beater and it gets piercing, so it's definitely worth it if you can bring it out, but that's kind of it. There's also a lot of ancient gear spells in here that just don't land either. Workshop is neat, but I don't really find it has much of a point. Explosive is a fun burn card, but it's only really meaningful if you're using it on one of your 3000 attackers, and at that point, it better be winning the game or else that's a huge loss in card economy. Ancient Gear Drill, Factory, Fist, and Tank are all just kind of middling too. They're just slow and clunky. Ancient Gear Castle is at least a bit better since it's a passive buff while eventually netting you an easier tribute summon, but overall I'm just not impressed with the Ancient Gear side of this deck. A couple more notable cards. Boot Up Soldier Dread Dynamo gets 2000 attack when you have a gadget on the field. Otherwise, it's 0. I won't miss words, I think this thing kinda just sucks. The slightly more reliable card is Stronghold the Moving Fortress. It's a trap monster, so it's a little more flexible to use as a tribute or something, and it gains 3000 attack, but only while you literally have all 3 gadgets in the field, which just realistically isn't happening that often. There's also a small Union package in this deck with 2 heavy mech support platform and a copy of Rollout. Again, this is neat, but Unions feel really slow when you have to use up a normal summon on them first. There's some other weird machine related back row cards in here too. Weapon Change lets you pay 700 life points in your standby phase to switch a machine's attack and defense. The idea is that a lot of the machines here have higher defense than attack points, but having to wait until the standby phase to make any use of it just makes this card really slow and awkward. Machine Duplication is also here, but it's only got 2 targets in the deck. Ancient Gear and Heavy Mech Support Platform, neither of which is worthwhile, and you'd only be able to summon 1 extra copy of it. So yeah, kind of another dud. One highlight here though is limiter removal. It doubles all your machine's attack points so you can go for a sudden blitz finish, but you better be sure it's going to work because you'll lose them all at the end of the turn. Rare Metal Morph is a pretty decent trap that can power up a machine by 500 and protect it from a targeting spell, so not too bad. Despite my rather lukewarm review of this deck so far, I will say it beats out the Dinosaur deck in the staple spell and trap department. This deck gave players access to a reprint of Pot of Avarice, which was a helpful mid-game card that acts almost like a Pot of Greed replacement. For this deck, the idea is basically to recycle your gadgets, which is fun. You also got a reprint of Enemy Controller, which is a notoriously versatile quick play spell. We also see the return of Sakuretsu Armor, one of my favorite battle traps at the time, and Ultimate Offering. For all the complaints I've had about how slow this deck can be, Ultimate Offering, if you manage to see it, can mitigate all of that. You can summon your gadgets and get multiple searches and set up big tribute summons and just speed up the use of your union monsters, really anything you need. Really good linchpin card here. On the other hand, I'm really not a fan of things like Micro Ray and Covering Fire. Covering Fire takes a bit of setup, but it can at least turn a battle. Micro Ray is just way too niche for my liking. Overall, I'm really not too impressed with the Machine Revolt structure. It's thematically sound, but there's just way too much junk in here. Monsters that are too slow to operate without much return, and way too many situational and underwhelming support spells and traps. Ironically, this deck was probably best used just as a way to give players access to Pot of Avarice, Enemy Controller, and the gadgets for use in other strategies, but I think the actual structure itself is just not it. Even the dinos, which were kind of middling, are still better. Sorry, Machine Revolt, you're going in the D tier, but at least you're above dragons for whatever that's worth. Our final rankings, we have in the D tier, Dragon's Roar at the very bottom, and then Machine Revolt. In the C tier, we've got Fury from the Deep, Dinosaur's Rage, Lord of the Storm, and then Invincible Fortress. In the B tier, we have Zombie Madness and Spellcaster's Judgment, and then the A tier, Blaze of Destruction and Warrior's Triumph at the very top. And with that, we've made it through all 10 of the original line of Yu-Gi-Oh! Structure decks. All in all, I have a few big takeaways. First, it was a good idea for Konami to make these. I know that sounds really obvious, but these decks really were an important lightning rod for directing Yu-Gi-Oh's largely young audience at the time toward the idea of actual synergy and intentional deck building, compared to most 100-card playground decks full of vanillas or the very rudimentary character starter decks of the time. While the idea of buying 3 copies of these decks probably wasn't the norm back then, especially since it was kids most likely begging their parents for just one of these decks, I still think they made a solid foundation for kids to start planning strategies and making changes that they would want to do in the future. I literally remember friends of mine who started out with one of these different decks. The second point is that many of these decks define specific type and attribute based gimmicks for Yu-Gi-Oh! In general. Fire monsters burn, wind monsters pop spells and traps, warriors used equip spells, and so on. Not every single gimmick landed perfectly, but there was definitely something unique about almost all of them. Next thing, these structures were releasing fast. Seriously, when you look at the release dates on these things, you'll see they were churning out an average of 5 decks per year. Compared to today, where we've gotten this whole snail's pace of entire years without new structure decks, it's a little depressing to know that there was such a better time. And combine that with releasing these products in pairs, and you've got a consistent on-ramp for new players at the time. And last big takeaway, these structure decks in general were stacked in the staples department. Realizing that even the worst deck on this list still came with Pot of Greed, Heavy Storm, Premature Burial, and Snatch Steal, a couple of which are still banned to this day, just wild. And all that for $10. And as for the decks themselves, you can see the obvious progression in product design and power as the months passed. I know it's not completely fair to compare the first couple decks to the last, but this video was all just for fun anyway. I don't think any of these decks was a complete flop, but if I had to give a personal favorite, I think I'd go with Warrior's Triumph. Just a nice, simple, all-around banger of a deck. What about you?